All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Shalin Jyotishi. I'll be kicking us off this afternoon. I'm the CEO of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance and a senior analyst at New America. We're a think tank and a media platform based in Washington, D.C. For those of us who are new to our organization, for 10 years, JSPG has been the international open access platform for students, postdocs, policy fellows, and early career researchers to contribute substantive policy solutions addressing every imaginable dimension of science, technology, and innovation policy debate. We publish policy memos and analyses, technology assessments, white papers, research-rooted op-eds, workshop proceedings, and other policy publications addressing topics as diverse as how to manage space debris to how to mitigate racial bias in AI. Through strategic partnerships like with our friends at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the UN, the UK Science and Innovation Network, and other national and international science policy organizations, our mission is to publish, nurture, and help elevate next generation science and technology policy voices. This event marks the final in a 6-part expert dialogue series co-hosted by JSPG and AAAS. The series coincides with our latest call for papers, which is generously supported by the Kavli Foundation. Our joint call for papers celebrates the 75-year anniversary of Vannevar Bush's seminal text, Science, the Endless Frontiers, which set the stage for much of U.S. science policy to date. Each one of our 6 expert dialogues have been helping authors get a sense of where they might consider writing, all connected to different areas where Endless Frontier might have either not addressed contemporary issues or could benefit from some expansion. JSPG and AAAS invite early career scientists, engineers, and policy professionals to submit policy position papers on a myriad of topics that will help us build a better future of American science and science policy for all. We invite ambitious, bold, and entrepreneurial ideas to tackle the most urgent and important science policy problems. The deadline to submit for this joint call for papers is April 4th, and you can learn more at sciencepolicyjournal.org. All recordings, including this one, will be posted on our YouTube channel, which I hope you'll subscribe to. And don't miss out on other opportunities. Follow JSPG on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We also have a monthly newsletter for special opportunities and ways to engage in the journal and through our partners. All drinks have been dropped in the chat for you all, so have a look, and we look forward to working with you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch with myself or members of our JSPG team, Joanne Lee, Adriana Bankston, and Sahil Mehta. Without Joanne, Adriana, and Sahil, we would not be gathered here today, so much gratitude to all of you. Today, we have an amazing panel to shed light on how the US can better optimize science policy to help us catalyze public engagement in science and community engagement in science. These speakers are so illustrious that their CVs alone could fill a volume of JSPG. So I will briefly introduce our great lineup here. And while I do, I invite you to follow them on Twitter. We'll be live tweeting during this session, and we encourage you to do the same. Share your thoughts, share your reflections, share your questions. The person who tweets the most will be invited to contribute to a special JSPG blog feature at the conclusion of her dialogue series, which this is. I'm going to share a visual so you can get a sense of who we have with us today. So you should see that on screen. Brilliant. So first off, we have our moderator, Erica Kimmerling. Erica is a senior advisor for science engagement policy and partnerships at the Association of Science and Technology Centers, a professional membership organization of 500 science and tech centers where the public engages science, including museums, aquariums, planetariums, zoos, botanical gardens, and more. Erica manages the Leaders in Science and Technology Engagement Network as an Aztec Civic Science Fellow, which was also supported by the Kavli Foundation and was previously a Hellman Fellow in Science and Technology Policy at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. one of the nation's oldest learned societies, and where Erica and I first met. At the Academy, Erica led Perceptions of Science in America and Encountering Science in America projects that were initiatives of the Public Face of Science initiative. She's also co-founder of BiteSci, a STEM education program, and was previously a NIH postdoc at Tufts University. Next up, we have Shannon Dosmagan, who's an environmental health and community science advocate. She's director of the Open Environmental Data Project and a co-founder of the Public Lab. She is also a fellow with the Shuttleworth Foundation and was previously a community researcher at Louisiana State University and Arizona State University. And she's had other roles at MIT's Center for the Future Civic Media Production and has worked on the grounds with environmental groups. Monica Feliu-Mojer is Director of Communications and Science Outreach at Ciencia Puerto Rico, a nonprofit of 13,000 plus scientists, students, and allies creating social impact in Puerto Rico. She is also the Director of Diversity and Communication Training at iBiology, a nonprofit producing free online videos to convey the excitement of modern biology. She's also the lead producer of a collection of short films focused on diversification of who can become a scientist called Backgrounds to Breakthrough, and she's been an Emerson Collective Fellow. She's been featured in Telemundo, Scientific American, Nuevo Dia Latino USA, and many other media outlets. And last but not least, we have with us Jeremy Scott Hoffman, who's Chief Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia and an affiliate faculty member at Virginia Commonwealth University. Jeremy specializes in earth science communication and community-based participatory science. His work has been written about in NPR, the New York Times, Upworthy, Here's 50, and many other media outlets as well. He served as a science communication fellow for the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry and the Mitchell Hamline College of Law. So we have a wonderful lineup of experts with us here today. Panel, thank you all so much for joining us. We're honored and excited to learn from you. We'll turn things over to Erica to take it from here. We'll have a discussion for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have audience Q&A for 20 minutes or so. Please drop your questions in the chat. The JSPG team will be monitoring and sharing them with our moderator. Live tweets, the graphic you see on screen is also available online. So the person who tweets the most will be invited to contribute to a JSPG blog feature. And of course, this is the conclusion of our series, so you will be contacted soon if you've been selected for one of those blog features. So Erica, thanks very much for moderating, and please take it away.
Thank you, Shalin, for that kind introduction and that flashback to when we, I think, worked together for all of a week or so at the Academy before you left. So before I introduce our panelists, who I'm very excited to talk with about this topic, I have been tasked with providing some context about the history of endless frontiers around this topic and the current moment. So in some of the reflections on the 75th anniversary on the Endless Frontiers publication, one of the quotes that keeps popping up is this: "Science by itself provides no panacea for individual, social, and economic ills. It can be effective in the national welfare only as a member of a team, whether the conditions be peace or war." We see that notion of science as a team member in the greatest and most visible scientific achievement of the moment. Basic translational and clinical research led to the development of multiple effective vaccines for a pandemic that has claimed over 500,000 lives in the United States alone. That vaccine is literally a cure for our ills, but that scientific achievement alone is insufficient. It needed to go through regulatory steps to ensure its safety and efficacy. It requires federal, state, and local governments to purchase and distribute a sufficient number of doses, a public health infrastructure capable of equitably allocating those doses to communities, and individuals who actually want to get the vaccine. The vaccine that matters is the one that makes it into the arm of a person. From this perspective, the work is far from over. And the important thing to note is that each of these steps are not independent. How the research is done, where the funding goes, and who has a say in it all matters. The societal context also matters. We know that there has been a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black Americans, but we are seeing lower rates of vaccinations among this community, whether it is due to structural barriers or vaccine hesitancy. Our national crises and cures are subject to societal contexts, including historical and current manifestations of systemic racism. Looking ahead, science needs to be grounded in this reality. And what is interesting about that original quote is that it acknowledges that science alone is not enough. And in discussing science as a member of a team, it seems to indicate that societal impact requires a certain amount of interaction outside of the scientific community. So if Endless Frontiers, did a really great job at establishing a foundation for science, I think looking ahead, we need to intentionally consider the scientific infrastructure that not only considers the impact of science on society, but the role of society in science. If we want science to be more effectively advance our national welfare. Put a different way, how can we ensure that more people are able to participate in the scientific enterprise, benefit from new advancements, and use science to address their own priorities? And it isn't that public engagement, community science work isn't happening. There is a wealth of knowledge and resources that currently exist in these fields, the fields of community engagement, community science, public engagement with science, public participation in science field. Part of the silos in the language in the fields is a little bit of the challenges that we run into. But these efforts are really account for a small and often unacknowledged portion of scientific activity. And in most cases, societal consideration, public participation remains an add-on in an unsupported activity or something that occurs in reaction to a crisis. In the last several years, there have been multiple efforts to address the landscape and recommend action. There was, as Shalin mentioned, a multi-year study at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called The Public Face of Science that looked at the complex and evolving ways people experience science and issued a set of priorities. These priorities for the future addressed everything from capacity within the scientific community to the science media landscape to the ecosystems that support public engagement with science. In addition, in partnership with the Day One Project, AAAAS, and Listen Networks, I was recently part of an effort that made the case for the need for a federal strategy for science engagement. I am not going to go into the details of these things. These reports are online. Links will be placed in the chat. But what it shows is that there are kernels and ideas and concrete policy actions that are starting to surface in these disciplines. So, a couple other framing things I want to say to this group. It should be noted that while we're the last webinar in the series and we fall into one of, multiple policy themes, I want this audience to not only think of potential policy actions and levers that affect public engagement with science as a field, but how public participation is actually related to all of the other topic areas that were discussed. Community resilience, STEM education, they're all tied together. So you can still consider public participation in science even if your policy proposal isn't on that topic explicitly. And if anything, I kind of encourage that thinking of weaving it throughout the entire enterprise. I hope the panel discussion today will inspire new ideas around how scientists participate in society and how society participates in science. Each of these expert practitioners you'll hear from today are doing the work now and as part of the current systems and institutional structures. So they'll share a little bit about their vision for the future, the tensions and barriers that they experience trying to do this work in this current system, and then potential changes that would allow more of it to happen. So with that being said, I'd like to start our discussion with our panel. So you've heard Monica's bio already. I'm not going to go over it again. But when you introduce yourself, I encourage you to talk a little bit more about the specifics of your work and really outline what is the ideal relationship between science and society that we should be striving to achieve. So Monica, over to you.
Thank you, Erica. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. My ideal relationship is a dialogue. I think there needs to be conversations, multilateral conversations. And in my work with Ciencia Puerto Rico, we approach this in a few ways. Our focus as an organization is on connecting science with the culture and the context of predominantly Puerto Rican audiences in focusing or fostering the civic engagement of scientists. So as it was mentioned in the introduction, we have a community of now over 14,000 people who are interested in science in Puerto Rico, and most of those people are scientists. And as an organization, we put that collective knowledge and the collective commitment of that community in service of Puerto Rico, and not just recognizing that scientists have a role to play in society, but also recognizing that communities, that different publics in Puerto Rico, they also have science knowledge, they use science, they may not think about it as they're doing science or they're using science, but that knowledge is there. So that that recognition of diversifying or amplifying our definition of who is doing science and who is a scientist is something that's really important to the work that we do. And to facilitate the dialogue, this exchange of knowledge and ideas, what we do is build capacity in the scientific community so that they can engage with society. We build capacity for their civic participation. As an organization, we focus on a few areas: science communication, K-12 science education, fostering the professional development of scientists, and then advocacy. And so through doing different types of trainings, we facilitate that scientists in our community participate in these different types of initiatives and build capacity for that civic participation through those different trainings. But on the other side, we're also building capacity amongst, the so-called general public, quote unquote general public, which of course doesn't really exist. It's not just one thing, there are multiple publics within that. We build their capacity through science engagement projects, and these audiences that we're engaging with are very different. They range from media to educators to, most recently, members of marginalized communities, where we're giving them the tools and science, ready to use science knowledge to promote COVID-19 prevention in their communities.
Thank you, Monica. One thing about that dialogue and that kind of bidirectionality that you talk about, and often overlooked and not emphasized enough point, is that it benefits science. We're not just talking about, like, it improves the work that is done. And there's plenty of evidence for that. So thank you for raising that point. Jeremy, would you like to kind of build on what Monica has said about community involved efforts?
Sure, yeah. And first I'd like to thank Monica for offering that idea of science as a dialogue, because I think that's really where the informal science education world, where I come from. I'm the chief scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia. We're a informal science learning science center in Richmond, Virginia. And I wanted to draw attention to the change in how kind of our what was said in the Endless Frontiers, and where the informal science learning world has kind of come around from those definitions. I think the Endless Frontiers says the responsibility for the creation of new scientific knowledge rests on that small body of men and women who understand the fundamental laws of nature and are skilled in the techniques of scientific research. That is such, when we hear that now, we hear, many of the same things that we've worked for decades to kind of deconstruct. And much of what my panel colleagues work in their everyday jobs is to kind of deconstruct that idea that science is only for the scientific experts to engage in. I want to then say, like, a few decades later, the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education report in 2009 said that scientific knowledge alone is not sufficient to fully address science that publics or experts can make useful, and that these publics can make contributions to the discussions and decisions about science and technology. So we've really moved in, I think, a lot of ways towards that idea that people belong in contributing to science through their own context and background. And so what we've worked on for several years at the Science Museum of Virginia is figuring out how to make this happen for particularly in aligned with environmental observations and climate change action. And so what we started to learn through our, just usual kinds of things like making videos for YouTube and those sorts of things, we're achieving much lower behavioral change or like action achievement than the things that were like, let's go out and collect data together and see where these issues overlap with our hyper localized, kind of day-to-day lives. And so what we've seen over the last several years, developing this community science initiative around understanding how heat disparity varies across cities, is that we can build coalitions between the scientific experts and community nonprofits that are currently at work in those sorts of not only neighborhoods, but with missions aligned with things like climate action, as well as the city governments where those two things might not have really met before in the middle. And we can really generate through, I think, the belief that scientific institutions like a science museum are one of the most trusted institutions for scientific information. We can serve as this kind of nexus point for the really important conversations that need to be had around those scientific issues like climate change. So we've actually seen a lot of that public deliberative forum work going on in informal science education centers that then move forward around a consensus of public and expert agreement about what comes next. I think that's really been what I've found to be the most engaging part of this process, is moving from that kind of expert engagement or the expert level or expert model to that community engaged model where we're all emerging with a shared vision of what comes next instead of the opposite from what we learned in Endless Frontiers. So thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I think you're starting to raise some key points around institutional infrastructure, and the institutions you're bringing up are not necessarily academic organizations or universities, but what's the infrastructure in communities to elevate this science agency, science capacity. And that's part of when we think about systems and systems change, we shouldn't be just thinking about traditional structures. And that actually leads me to Shannon, who's been doing this work from a grassroots level. And I'd be curious to hear now your thoughts around this relationship between science and society from that perspective.
Sure, and the bio that was read for me made me realize I probably didn't share my own. I am actually an organizer. That is what I classify myself as, and a practitioner. And I think what has driven me in my work is, what Monica landed on is dialogue and the importance of multi-directionality in science. That science is a conversation, and that we should be thinking about science, not only how people can help uplift and support, but also what science can do to better support the priorities of society. My own work has taken me all around the world to support people who have issues with industrial pollution, using science and using open technology as just one tool that they can apply to these issues. And so I really think about how science can sit hand in hand with the organizing work that communities are already doing. So that really gets back at the kind of dialogue and multi-directional nature of what science can be. And I'm specifically interested in this because I think, though despite how far we've gotten in these conversations about what science engagement looks like, we are still creating silos in which policies that are made, about communities are made about communities. They're not made in conversation with the people who are going to be most impacted by them. So I led an organization called Public Lab for a decade that was really kind of getting into the how do we functionally build spaces where scientists, organizers, educators, technologists can all come together and collaborate. And we started seeing really, cool and kind of informative models around community science arise from the projects that we were doing. And I think the thing that kind of drove me to the next place in my career, where I'm now leading a project called the Open Environmental Data Project, is that I really wanted to see science and tech be used as a tool for moving beyond communication and engagement. So with all of the advances that we are seeing in science and technology today, we should be thinking more and more about the usability of science in different contexts for policy setting, for being engaged in decisions, for in the environmental context, being involved in enforcement and check and balance processes with government. So I'm going to leave it there, but I think, I just want to highlight, like, once again, this nature of science as dialogue and science as a conversation. That's utmost importance.
Well, actually, Shannon, I'm going to stick with you on that point, because this, this notion of science as a conversation and the usability of science, what are the current barriers and tensions in the current system that kind of gets in the way of that conversation or that usability, and like what can be done about them? So what are you seeing prevents that conversation?
Sure. So, again, my perspective is as a practitioner, but I'm a practitioner who, works in a lot of science contexts with a lot of scientists. And, I think the thing that there's a couple of things I want to pull out. One of them is really how young scientists are trained is potentially problematic because of the continued promotion of individualism and expertise as something that comes in the form only of a PhD. So I think science has a long way to go, and Monica also landed on this earlier, but science has a long way to go to really look at where experiences and where different forms of expertise can lie, whether that's multi-generational, whether it's based on knowing the ecological trends of the place that you live in and having watched it month after month after month, year after year. I think, to do better at this, scientists, should of course be trained in the sciences, but also to be better listeners, to learn how to build dialogue, facilitate conversations, and really think about the way that their expertise can sit in parallel to the expertise of others. My good friend and colleague Thomas Mboa talks frequently about cognitive justice, and I think this is a really important concept that scientists should be thinking about, so that we can not diminish what other people know and the truths of other people. The second thing that I just want to highlight briefly is that in communities, there are many times that science and the scientific actors that put science into play have actually caused harm historically. So, we talk right now with the new administration a lot about scientific integrity and we're building trust and we're rebuilding trust. But until we really address some of the harm that science has caused and the complicated and many times problematic relationships that scientists have engaged with as they've rushed to partner with communities, we're not going to have done the true work of what it's going to take to really make science a valuable tool for society.
Thank you, Shannon. And knowing Monica and what the work that she does, I'm going to just kick it over to her to kind of continue building on some of these tensions and barriers.
Yeah, there's something that was kind of, as I was listening to Jeremy and Shannon, that came to mind with this question. And I think there are many, many challenges. But one thing that I wanted to mention is the persistence of the deficit model. The deficit model is this idea that if you just provide people with information, they're going to come on board and they're going to love science and they're going to believe you and they're going to get vaccinated or, whatever it is. And that the deficit model, it refuses to die. It should die, but it refuses to die in part because it's how we've been doing science communication for a long, long time. But we know that this model of unidirectional, I'm the expert, I'm going to tell you, and then you're going to listen and do as I say, that doesn't work. And so that's why we need to move towards engagement, towards this multilateral conversations through engage in meaningful partnerships that really take into account what is the different parts, the different stakeholders bring to the table. That's why I like to think about my work and the work of Ciencia Puerto Rico as putting science in service of. When recently I've been working with different marginalized communities in Puerto Rico to put together this COVID-19 kit. And one of the communities that we've been engaging with a lot is the deaf community. And what I'm saying is, I am not deaf. I do not know the experiences of that community. And what I've said is, first of all, I found a trusted messenger, somebody who works with that community, who is part of that community, who can help me learn, not educate me, but help me educate myself about what is it that I need to do. And then how do I, from my privilege, from the resources, the knowledge that I have, how do I serve that community? And how do I learn from them? Because they have a lot to teach me as well. So again, thinking about those meaningful partnerships. In terms from more of the scientist's perspective is, public engagement is not rewarded or incentivized, particularly in academic institutions. I don't work in academia, but I'm academia adjacent. And I also work a lot with scholars, students in particular, who come from historically marginalized backgrounds. And for these kind of people, doing outreach or doing engagement is something that is very important to them, because they want to engage with their communities, they want to give back to their communities, but it's often a catch-22 because this is not rewarded, it's not incentivized, but on the other hand, they're often asked to do this type of work, to do the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So they're overburdened with that. They're not rewarded by it. And also, if they bring their full selves, all of their identities to science spaces, then they're also penalized. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is particularly in academia, is reframe the value of engagement, to create opportunities for academics to researchize, as my friend Dr. Rachel Burks say, where Rachel is a chemist, and she does analytical chemistry as part of her research, but she also does a lot of science communication and engagement. And she has found ways to make that part of her scholarship so that she is rewarded as she's moving through the tenure track system. The other thing that I think we have to do is rethink how building the capacity of scientists in science engagement is valuable to the broader scientific enterprise. One thing that Ciencia Puerto Rico does, we have a program that's called the Yale Ciencia Academy that gives PhD students professional development. And among the things that students do is they have to do a public engagement project as part of their fellowship. And we provide them with the training and the support to do that, but we're also providing them, through that science engagement, they have an opportunity to explore how their identities, who they are, what they bring to the table, how does that fit in science, and how do they use that to make science a more inclusive space?
I absolutely love that sentiment. And I think it goes back to how engagement in these practices, we're talking a lot about things about being able to have a dialogue and be open and bring your whole self, and how it shouldn't be just a thing that occurs in the space of engaging with the public, but science should live by those practices as well. And speaking of things that science should do, Jeremy, I know your work with the Science Center and working with scientists, how much, to Monica's point, have you encountered the deficit model, and how much has that been a barrier to your work? And can you build on some of the themes that have been raised already?
Absolutely. There's so much to say after both Shannon and Monica. They're the eloquent and, comprehensive answers that were given. It feels, a little bit, I'll just try and add what I can, where I can, just reflecting on my own experience. here in Richmond. I think, you know, and further abroad is that, you know, coming up through my graduate school experience, you know, I was only trained in science communication around that idea of deficit model. And I think that that's still one of the main reasons why you'd hear that scientists aren't feeling like they're not heard and that their work isn't impacting society. Why wouldn't people just get it, you know? And I think that what I've learned and what we've learned as an institution through this process is that, you know, I think it's really about becoming a part of your community, at the sense of, you know, are you a part of the neighborhood? Are you contributing to bettering the block, you know, the houses a few blocks away? And so, like, I like to talk about our partner, the Virginia Community Voice. It's a nonprofit focused on engaging community along the Richmond Highway corridor in Richmond, and they have this equitable community engagement model that really centers the idea that someone's personal lived experience is just as important as your PhD when people are coming to the table to have conversations around how to apply science to a particular question. And so I just wanted to say that resonates with me very deeply and builds on the idea of science being a dialogue where we you know, the PhD and the deficit model actually harms that potential to have that conversation. And I think that also feeds back on the idea of trust. You know, we hear this regularly in all of the cities that we've done and tried to instill one of these community science heat campaigns. And what I'll say is that it's taken years of work following the initial collaboration that we built around extreme heat in Richmond to really solidify like funding opportunities and new projects that spun off of the original one. And one of the most important aspects was, how do you maintain that trust beyond the grant? If your work is fully reliant on there being this, you know, grant opportunity or grant funding in place, then are you really participating in this collaboration in a meaningful and honest way? And what if the next grant fails? You know, how are you entering into an iterative process with your community partners that enables you to find new ways and new funding streams to collaborate and maintain that trust? And I guess one of the main things too is to figure out, on the flip side of that, is these grant cycles, a really truly community engaged anti-deficit model collaboration takes so much longer than a usual grant cycle that we're expected as academics to achieve you know, significant findings during. And so I think that there's something to be said about not only shifting the culture around awarding scientists that participate in these sorts of activities, but looking at the thing that we rely on as scientists to further our careers, which is grants. You know, how do we start to change that as well? So I know I'm probably not actually adding particularly too much to this conversation, because Monica and Shannon have so much more and eloquent ways to describe it. But I hope that helped my view of how this model can change for the better.
Thank you, Jeremy. And actually, your raising of grant structures trickles into my next topic area that I wanted to talk about. And I know it comes up, having had a bunch of these incentives, disincentives, barriers conversation. Money always comes up, funding sources, the need for funding for public engagement is a thing. I agree with that. But I want to get into a little bit of the how and what the money should, if there were money, what it should go to, how it should be structured. How structuring of money leads to issues of equitable relationships. So Jeremy, sticking with you, having received funding from, I know in your work from agencies like NOAA, can you talk a little bit about the funding structures that would incentivize these kind of more positive relationships with communities?
Absolutely. You know, and I think, again, I've learned from the community partners that we've developed and the relationships that we've developed over the last several years to communicate this, is that, you know, I think what unfortunately many of our grant awarding you know, agencies and such see the collaborators as, you know, reimbursement style payment. You know, so you have to do the labor and perform the activities in order to get the money that we talked about you getting as the reason why you should join into this grant. I think that that's the single biggest switch that we could make, that and we have made at the Science Museum of Virginia, where we can start to, instead of it being a reimbursement style, is that we are paying you up front, in a sense, for participation. And this model is actually being, applied in a couple other places based on this kind of participation model instead of reimbursement. Also, I think that there has to be, a transparent budget development throughout the in your collaborations with community partners, because as you mentioned, in what, I think Monica and Shannon both mentioned, was that these power structures exist, and the organization that is developing the proposal, ultimately will additionally get the things like the overhead money, and how are those being accounted for, and then what the other organizations get, and really being open about how the money is being broken down has been an especially important aspect of grant development. And then there was one last aspect of it that I was going to talk about. And then ultimately, if you have volunteers and people that are going to be engaged in your community science program, they have to be compensated just like the rest of the project team. And that might come as like such a surprise to some folks, but the rewarding the people and honoring their time and effort and labor in achieving the scientific or otherwise outcomes that you and your partners have, acknowledging that there's participation funding like in the sense of a gift card, or something, at least participation being scaffolded in the sense of interpreters, childcare, all of those sorts of things. That needs to be at the center, and a non-negotiable part of a budget development. So that I'll stop there and let my panel colleagues speak to that as well. But I think that those are the main lessons that we've learned in grant development through our partnerships, and it's served to make really, really good and I think comprehensive budgets that all of the partners are excited about.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I'm just going to go straight to Shannon, since Shannon's work directly with communities. What are your kind of thoughts on these funding structures in order to get community involvement and engagement?
I think they're really problematic. I think systemically they're problematic. And I would say, so I'm going to place myself on the receiving side of what those problems look like as somebody who has been with small nonprofits for most of my career. It's especially with the federal grants, there's always this kind of season, where there's a NSF ASIL or, one of those kind of proposals that requires people to have community partners, where there's just a mass rush of, emails that we receive, usually about, a couple of weeks, a month before the proposal has to go in. So what funding structures do is they set us up for failure before we even have the opportunity to build relationships. And what it looks like on the community end or the nonprofit end is it's very demeaning, the language that's used to talk about community partners, the boxes that community partners are put in terms of what their contributions can and cannot look like. It basically disallows a structure where we can create equity through joint relationships where we're working across a spectrum of activities, not just where scientists are supposed to work and where communities are supposed to work. So I think that is something that especially federal funding, government funding needs to look at. But I think all funding agencies can think about is what in the language, what in the structure, what in the way they request partnerships, what are they setting up that may be inequitable for the people that then have to follow through and engage in those models. And then I think the second thing that I would note is, Jeremy, I think you got at this a bit, is that science moves at a very different pace than trust. And so, when we look at the timelines under which we're having to develop projects, I'm thinking with my brain on, probably the first thing I want to do is sit down and have a meal and sit down and have a conversation and sit down and understand, what's going on, not just in this kind of scientific-y project that we may embark on together, but what are the stresses? What are the opportunities in your community? So I think, from a funding perspective, what that means is being really reflective of the problematic timelines, so science working under one, funding working under another, and then trust building and relationship development working under another. And functionally, I think what that means is that we have to consider funding for longevity and funding for the longevity of relationships. So we live, in kind of a constant cycle of like 1-year funding, 18-month funding, even 2-year funding. And it's really hard to kind of spin something up, meet all the outcomes deliverables, and then potentially spend something down, if funding ends. So yeah, there's just, I think, some really deeply entrenched systemic things. And I've talked to many, many funders over my career, and I know that these are very complicated and difficult things to address across the board. But this is a great time to be doing it because there's so much attention and interest in how we can really, do better at being equitable in our community partnerships.
So for our last reflection, I'm gonna pose the same question to Monica, but as a reminder, this is kind of the last of the formal. So we've been gathering your questions and trying to synthesize them and find some common themes. Continue to submit your questions. And Monica, would you like to build on what Shannon said?
Absolutely. I mean, I co-sign with what Jeremy and Shannon have said. I think there's one of the things that Shannon said about collaboration is like collaboration, especially collaboration with marginalized communities that have been historically abused and marginalized by science. It advances at the speed of trust, and trust takes time. It takes time, it takes money, it takes energy. And one of the things I think in terms of thinking about the systems of funding that funders could do is rethink about, what is it, what are the deliverables and outcomes that you're wanting? Like often funders, what they want is they want a product. They want like you build something, an exhibit, a toolkit, something, there's a product. And that when it comes to working with marginalized communities, building that trust and that relationship, that is a really valuable product that's often not seen. And so I think funders need to rethink what is it that you're asking organizations and communities to do when you're funding them? How are you going to evaluate the success of that partnership and that project that you are that you're funding? The other thing that we have to think about is that there are cultural differences between academia and how communities work. Shannon mentioned that the speed at which academic work moves, and when as a community organizer, you are often the first responder to a challenge or an emergency in your community. You're not thinking 18 months ahead, like, oh, I'm going to apply for this grant, and then it's going to take them 9 months to review it, and then it's going to take 3 months for the money to come in, and then I can begin my work. Now, in that meantime, people will get sick, people will die. And so we have to take into account these cultural differences of how the different systems and the different groups of different stakeholders work, and find ways to create synergies so that we can actually partner, so that we can actually benefit each other. The last thing that I'll say is that, funders, they need to, in terms of like the criteria that they're establishing for, RFAs, like requests for applications or for proposals, they need to rethink about what is it that you want the people who are applying, the grantees or potential grantees, to do. If you are thinking about a project, like a research project, and you want an outcome that's going to produce value to a community, well, who defines that value? Is the value really being defined from the perspective of the community, or is it being defined from a more privileged perspective that it's going to come from, I don't know, like an agency or a foundation? So I think we also have to rethink about what are we defining as value when it comes to, outcomes and products of these partnerships. And actually, I have one last thing to do. The other thing to say, the last thing I will say is that funders often, they don't, again, they focus on the products. They don't focus on the relationship building, and they don't focus on providing money that is unrestricted. Like often as an organization who's being supported by an agency or a foundation, you're rushing to meet a deadline, to meet a very defined deliverable, and that restriction can be harmful, especially when you're working with communities where you need to be nimble and responding to their needs.
Thank you, Monica. And actually, there's been some great conversation in the chat about some of these points, and I encourage everyone on the panel to also peek in at that. And I wanted to amplify one of the notions that Carolyn put in the chat about how do we work within a capitalistic mindset. So the capitalistic mindsets that we need science that makes institutions money, oftentimes bringing technologies to the communities that need it most cost money as opposed to making money. And how do we change that framing? And I really appreciate that framing of the question in that way as well. And we had a couple questions around alternative funding structures, and sticking with the notions that have come up, that like the idea that in this case, the process and not the product isn't kind of the more important thing, how it's done. Are there examples from other disciplines and areas of this kind of dynamic funding model that plugs in and appreciates and upholds the process? Do you have any sense of funding structures that exist that actually do this, or are we kind of going to need to, as part of the thing we need is room to experiment with these funding structures? And I put that out to the group.
I mean, I would say I work across a lot of different areas, and I would say that over the last 2 years, especially, funders who are working in the social justice and environmental spaces are really starting to critically look at the way that they give funding. We still see these instances where, who is it, Amazon or somebody gives like billions of dollars to like the massive, green NGOs and leaves out environmental justice organizations. But I think that in those sectors specifically, we're starting to see new models emerge that funding is more, not yet evenly, but is in the direction of heading to more evenness in terms of who it's allocated for.
I would echo that, what Shannon just said. It's really environmental, climate. We're really fortunate to have support from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of Education. And they've recently published a theory of change around resilience education that centers community experience and needs as part of the building of your program. And so I think that I would just echo what Shannon's saying, is that there's been a really strong look at how are we supporting, these educational outcomes that may have, are beyond going just about to be improved literacy. What are the other metrics that you're using to assess success of your project? Because it should go beyond just, does someone know the difference between, methane and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? So I would just say that's begun to have a much more critical eye on it. And I'm really, really thrilled that the folks at the Office of Education at NOAA have been so attuned to learning more about what these organizations, the ones that they seek to build, from the ground up kind of community resilience, what they need, and have put it to practice. So I'm really, really fortunate.
I think that's a great point too, that some of these structures may actually already be in government, and that the idea for some agencies, the need for agencies to learn from each other. And that was actually some of the things that we touched on in the day one memo on why a federal strategy would actually be important. The idea about sticking with this notion of how it's done and the process and the importance of that for community engagement, we got a question around that in relation to this publish or perish structure in academia. So how do we rework to de-individualize a lot of academic work to make time and space to collaborate from the beginning in an equitable sense with communities outside of our elitist institutions? So that was kind of the question, is how do we de-individualize academia to take it away from a publisher parish model? And would love to hear anybody's thoughts on what's necessary in order to have that happen.
I mean, I think this is a complex problem. And so there are multiple players who are going to need to play a role. I was talking to someone recently and they were telling me, like, you know, if there's one thing that you should know about bureaucracies is that no matter how much you try to break things apart, like they're just built for not, they refuse to die. That's how they're built. And so, you know, I think in general, we have to think about what are the levers of change, and, you know, what are the power structures, and where are those opportunities to start moving things that might have an impact. And so, you know, I think funding agencies have a role to play in terms of, like, what is it that we value as scholarly production, you know, like if what we're going to value is what is the knowledge that you're producing, is publishing a paper the only way to produce knowledge? You know, like what are other ways in which we can measure that productivity? How do we shift, again, that definition of knowledge production from, instead of being that narrow definition of it must be a paper that is peer reviewed and that comes from an academic institution, how do we redefine that? You know, and I think, I mean, money is an important motivator. So I think funding agencies have, in broadly defined, not just federal funding agencies, but also foundations. I think that's one of the players that needs to play a key role. There are others, but I'm gonna stop there.
That also makes me think of efforts to elevate scientific methods and data as part of the deliverables of science, not just the end publications. And Shannon, knowing the work that you work on, how is this related to efforts to increase the usability of scientific data and the structures that are necessary to actually get usable, actionable data from the beginning? And is that similar? And can you talk a little bit about how you incentivize that?
Sure. I'm just on the last point super quickly. I want to share a colleague of mine. I just put the links in the chat. Did a very public promotion and tenure file when she went up for tenure, but was somebody who has been an artist in a previous life, does really intensive community work at the Civic Lab for Environmental Action Research. And so I encourage, you know, people to take a look at that in case it's helpful in kind of getting at that previous question. Moving on to the next question about data usability. So I think, you know, what I became very cognizant of in my my kind of previous places that I have worked is that you know, and this is in partnering with scientific institutions, it's in partnering with scientists, is that we do put a lot of effort onto the goals that are prioritized in grant applications, and that are prioritized because, you know, scientists have deliverables in their broader careers that we have to meet, or that they have to meet. And what this does is that it has created this kind of vast landscape. I had somebody referred to it recently to me as like the Wild West of environmental data, in which you know, we kind of solve for the, like, getting to the end of the research question and getting something into publication, but we don't solve then for, like, what's the use and the benefit of data that we're asking people to collect. And you know, in and of that as well is we've gone through this, you know, over the last decade, opening up of scientific data, environmental data, but it hasn't actually focused on, you know, findability, accessibility, usability. So these are things that we should be putting enormous amounts of effort into. You know, so I critique the field of citizen science, which I've been pretty intimately involved in, and even sometimes I critique community science as well, because there's There's a kind of consistent drive to collect information, to collect data. And we're doing that while we're also not solving the deep systemic infrastructural issues that exist and actually making science, data, and information work for the people that need it most. So that's what I'm working on right now. I feel like I, kind of stepped off a cliff into one of the biggest challenges of my life, but it's also really exciting. I will drop a link to some of my work in the chat if anybody wants to follow along.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, go Jeremy.
I was just going to say, if I can kind of riff off of Shannon, because I think she's really speaking to something that has taken, the whole field, talking about citizen science versus community science and data, usability and everything, is what I find through really concerted, multi-year trust building and figuring out community needs and how science can help those needs and where they see it to fit in and all that sort of stuff. It gives data that is generated in these campaigns or in these community science programs, like a certain amount of civic legitimacy that I don't think is achieved in some other kind of more deficit model kinds of ways. And so I mean that, like, for an example, in what we work on a lot is like, there are satellites in space that are floating around taking pictures of the Earth's surface. So this faceless robot just like floating around in space, and they can take a photo of the Earth's skin temperature. And that can tell us a lot about how temperatures vary across an urban environment. It turns out part of our own research has shown that that tends to disproportionately impact communities of color, particularly with this historical lens on redlining, which we don't have a second to get into right now. But compare that kind of removed sense of data collection with on the ground data collection from members of the community who helped co-develop the methodology, who know where the hotspots already are. They're going to use those data for interventions like a tree canopy planting, because we have already set up that kind of community partnership that will seek to improve that environmental disparity. What I think is key to what Shannon spoke to, though, was like, we still aren't doing enough to fix the root cause of why those environmental disparities exist. And so that's where I think the science needs to meet that, again, that idea of science can only be a part of a team. And it's like, to dismantle the systemic racism and inequality in our cities and across the country, that takes more than just the information. But by training and creating, cultivating this relationship among communities in our city, we've actually seen over the last few years there being specific policies being passed at the local and state level that seek to intervene on that. But again, that's been a lot longer than a traditional grant cycle. So it kind of shines a light on all of what we've talked about here today.
What you're talking about raises a point that we saw, makes me think about a point I saw in one of the earlier questions, because we've often talked about the dialogue, the trust when it comes to communities, but one of the questions actually asked is about community familiarity and agency around science. So like, how familiar does a community need to have awareness and understanding of the ramifications and possibilities of science in order to engage with science? So what level of familiarity in a community is necessary for this type of civic engagement in order to make it accessible? So love to hear your thoughts around that.
I think we have to rethink what that means. Like, familiarity with science is based on whose definition of science. Like, if you ask indigenous communities what is science, like that, it's part of what they do and how they approach life. It's not something that's necessarily separately defined. Like, similarly, this week I was talking to people in the deaf community, and we were talking about how their marginalization is such that if you ask them about what does science have to do with your life, they will likely say it's a class in school. That's it. And so I think we have to rethink about, like, what does it mean that a community is familiar with science? Are we talking about science as it's defined by academia, by Western standards? And so I think the way I think about it is, first is that recognition that communities that I'm engaging with are likely doing science as I define it, the systematic approach to a problem, to a natural issue. And then thinking about, where can we meet in the middle or somewhere where like that definition of what science, my definition of science and what they're doing, like where I can understand it from their perspective. And then how do we work together? Because in my experience, especially when you're working with communities that are marginalized and that have a lot going on, they're not thinking about like, how do I use science to address this? They need to fix a problem. And so they're thinking about it from the perspective is, how do I address this problem? How do I make my lives and the lives of the people around me better? So I think we have to reframe that definition of, do communities know enough science, to, whose definition of science anyway?
Before our other panelists hop in, and I know they want to, that actually piggybacks on another question around that was explicitly asked: how do we elevate other ways, non-Western ways of knowing science? So specifically, it was asked, how do we elevate Indigenous science to the level of PhD research in terms of how we're talking about this? And do you have any thoughts on how we elevate these other ways of knowing and other approaches to science in the conversation? Anybody can continue to answer this question, but I wanted to add that question because it's come up.
Well, I think there are people that are doing it, and I'd say people because it's still a lot of individuals that are having to wage the war in their own academic departments. And waging a war isn't maybe not the best term, but like that are having to go that route themselves, and then like convince others to come along with them. So I think there is a place in science to take a look around and see what already exists and try to figure out like, how do you institutionalize some of the amazing work that are coming from Indigenous and other communities? It's not mainstream enough yet that that like the work has to be done from all different angles.
I was going to highlight just some examples that I've been, of people that are working in institutions that are working to elevate or, identify the contributions of their local Indigenous cultures in their understanding of the world. And so one of the best examples of this is the Wild Center in upstate New York, actually engaged with their local Indigenous groups to co-develop an exhibit. And to include even the writing, the copy on the labels and everything was going to be presented multilingually, including in the Indigenous culture language. And so that's an example, I think, of institutionalizing the importance, because then you think about all the schools, all of the visitors, many hundreds of thousands of people a year that then see those that other way of knowing as just as valid as Western style knowing science. And then I would just turn some folks onto the work of Beth Roach. It's just a person that has worked extremely hard, first as a climate justice organizer for Mothers Out Front, but now works within the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound watershed, which is kind of a shared boundary between Virginia and North Carolina. And they've done so much work with the EPA and several partners like NC State and the William and Mary Coastal Policy Center to really establish a climate preparedness plan that is entirely formed from and true to the Indigenous ways of knowing for those Indigenous groups. So I'd just like to say that there are some examples, but as Shan mentioned, it hasn't yet been, there's still people that are just fighting for it to be acknowledged as a worthwhile thing to communicate. And I think until we can start to get to those root causes of that, why are you so uncomfortable with that being an issue, then we're not gonna see it as everywhere in the same way.
Yeah. I'll add quickly, and there's a lot of work to be done here, but there are a couple of things that I think we can all do. Educate yourself. That's the first thing. Like, like if you've never heard of this before, there are these traditional ways of knowing. There are non-Western ways to approach science or just the world. And so build on that awareness and choose and seek to educate yourself. And then the second thing is we can all use our privileges. Like we probably, all of us here, occupy spaces of privileges in different ways. So I often think about how do I use my privileges to not give voice to these people because these people have voices, they've just been silenced or, denied a platform. So how do I use my privileges to elevate these voices, to give people these platforms so that I can support, so that those people that have been fighting on their own to make sure that Indigenous knowledge is recognized, how do I make their work a little bit easier with the privileges that I have?
So I am seeing we are like about 5 minutes out, and there was one other area of questions that came up, but we're not really going to fully get to, which is around, because it was raised around scientist skills and the training and support for scientists to do this work. And what does that look like? That came up early on. I will point people in the audience to a resource that recently came out on inclusive science, the state of inclusive science communication, that talks about key traits of inclusive SciComm being intentionality, reciprocity, and reflexivity, and goes into those in detail. So I think that is a place to start when we start talking about these skills and attributes in order to do the work, a good starting point for our listeners. Does anyone else have any thoughts on kind of quick thoughts on skills before we get to our closing question, or things that scientists need to know how to do in order to do this work?
I personally, as a scientist that has tried to educate myself and participate in this work and really center it as part of what I think I would like to do for the rest of my career, is like humility. And like, I mean, just the fact that people that just like the expert model, Monica was so right on with that, is like, I'm not filling someone's empty head, and understanding that and really internalizing that is so central to participating in public engagement with science. Otherwise, you might do harm, as Shannon mentioned, and continue to perpetuate the harm that has befallen these communities that we're seeking to help.
And I would, I love humility as a word and concept and thing to do. I guess I would also, there's just not enough active listening that happens in science. And I think it's so hard for many people, and it's such a simple thing that we can try to change. And then functionally, I don't know who all of you are, but many of you are scientists, but you're also part of a community or part of many different communities. And I think, it's what I've seen sometimes be beneficial to people is, without your label and your identity as a scientist, join in on a community effort. Right now, mutual aid networks are very popular because of the pandemic and, other reasons. But experience what it's like to be, actively part of doing something out in your own community if you have not done that before or haven't done it recently, just to kind of better understand the dynamics that arise.
Yeah, and I'm gonna build upon what both Jeremy and Shannon have said. Humility is super important. Listening, that empathy is like the most important part about effective communication, and effectively connecting with someone is often the things that you don't say. And that includes listening. And so to that, I will add, I think, I'm a scientist by training, and I think for many scientists that I work with, they come in with this idea that data speaks for itself, and it doesn't. It does not. Data does not speak of itself, never has, never will. Data has to be put in context, and that context needs to include the awareness that people's culture, values, their life experiences, they impact how they perceive, how they value, how they understand, how they trust science. And so keeping this in mind is really, really important, if we really want to move, public engagement and forward and make it truly equitable and inclusive.
On that note, we come to the end of our panel. Thank you so much to the three of you for this incredibly rich discussion. I know I couldn't have designed a better way to end my Friday work week than being with all of you to talk about this. This has been such a fruitful conversation, and I have been tasked with passing it back to Shalin to close things out. But thank you so much for joining me in this discussion.
Thanks so much, Erica. And I just like to add my thanks, Shannon, Jeremy, and Monica. I learned a great deal from our conversation. Folks, could we actually do a virtual clap? Just type anything in the chat or thank yous just to show our panel our appreciation. This was a fabulous session. What a capstone to our JSPG-AAAS Endless Frontier dialogue series. The other thing I wanted to mention is, we do have our call for papers around Endless Frontier, but this issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion is a key priority for JSPG. And we actually do have another call for papers that has been launched in partnership with our colleagues at the National Science Policy Network. And I just dropped the link in the chat. It's around intersectional science policy. So I invite you to consider that as another opportunity to share your ideas in case some of your work maybe isn't so aligned necessarily with science policy, but touches on some of these other important issues we've been discussing. We have this other opportunity. So I just wanted to put that out there. And with that, just a reminder, we do have all of our recordings available on YouTube. This session will be up on YouTube by the end of today or this weekend. So you can check back. If you have colleagues who would benefit from the conversation, you can share it with them. And as always, thank you very much for joining JSPG on a Friday afternoon in Eastern time anyways. And just another round of applause for our great panel. And thank you, Erica, for moderating this great discussion. Yep. Snaps, virtual snaps. Cheers, everyone. Thank you very much for joining.